if
yeah.
hopefully our two guests are here. We have two gentlemen that I'll be interviewing today, and they are both at the Apartment Association of Orange County. Department of Association of Orange County, headquartered in Santa Ana, has over 100,000 units within it, which their members, owners, property managers hold in portfolio. So it's a very substantial organization. There's David Cordero on the screen. Welcome, David. We'll be joined also by Chip Ahlswede in a minute. And first for David, David is the executive director of the Apartment Association of Orange County. He's been there since 2019. And David has 25 years of experience in communications, government relations, public affairs, and association management, both in the public and private sectors. Just I'll mention that he was the government affairs manager with the Municipal Water District of Orange County, and he was previously director of public affairs with the Building Industry Association, BIA, of Southern California. And he's been operating as chief executive of AAOC now, as I said, for approximately 3 years. Welcome, David. Good to see you.
Thanks, Nick.
Let me also introduce Chip Ahlswede. Chip is the vice president of external affairs for the Apartment Association of Orange County. He's come on board in the last year. Chip has, there he is. Hi, Chip. Welcome. Chip has extensive background in association management and government relations, in addition to some strategic consulting, or not some, lots of strategic consulting experience serving clients in the US and abroad. And Chip was the CEO for 4 years of the Greater Los Angeles REALTORS, which was an 11,000 member association of realtors in Beverly Hills, Culver City, Los Angeles, Santa Monica, and West Hollywood. So covering a lot of high-end space in Southern California in Los Angeles County. He also co-founded Government Affairs Strategists, a LLC, a full-service public affairs firm dedicated to assisting businesses, organizations, and individuals in government relations and political efforts. So both of these gentlemen have deep backgrounds in political affairs, government relations, and part of what we'll talk about in just a bit is rent control and its impact on the multifamily market in Southern California and Orange County in particular. So welcome, gentlemen. David, let me start off with you, if I may. And can you give us just the broadest of overviews of the California rent control law, which went into effect in January of 2020. It was, a lot of people know it as AB 1482. It's a huge factor for apartment owners. Where is that legislation now? What do you tell people, in your 1-minute overview of how that rent control law works and affects apartment owners?
Sure, Nick. Not much has changed since AB 1482 took effect 2 years ago. It was certainly a battle that was fought hard within the multifamily industry and other real estate interests as well statewide, recognizing just the threat of what the statewide rent cap posed for those who utilize and certainly own and operate income property here in the state. It's the first statewide application of rent control that we've seen. As you know, of course, rent control is not new to California. We've got different jurisdictions that have had it since the late 1970s. Santa Monica, Berkeley, San Francisco, to name a few. It's a policy that we've seen in other parts of the country. New York City, of course, being perhaps the longest rent controlled jurisdiction, but also more recently, we've seen policies adopted in other cities around the country, including Minneapolis and St. Paul a few months back. And of course, locally here in Orange County, in the city of Santa Ana in November. AB 1482 basically establishes a maximum rent cap of 10% per year increase. And it is something that is based on a 5% cap essentially for the rental property owner. And then the balance of the cap is based upon the inflation rate for the year. And so right now, say here in Orange County, the inflation adjustment rate is 3.6%. So for Orange County rental properties, if you are an apartment building that is 15 years or older, you are looking at an 8.6% rent cap that would run basically through the summer. The new numbers typically that we use come out in April each year, and they are then able to take effect, usually I believe with August 1st being the new date for that new increase. Certainly,
so David, just to mention, as I was talking about earlier, inflation being, this is a national number, inflation 7%. So it's almost our regional CPI will take us to a 10% number here in coming months, I take it.
Absolutely. And, it'll vary by, tenth of a point, in some other areas. I mean, like I said, here in Orange County right now, we're looking at 3.6. If you go up to Northern California, and I think right now it varies between 3.4 and 3.5 in certain jurisdictions, but for our region, which basically encompasses LA, Orange County, Long Beach, and currently Riverside and San Bernardino as well, we're all looking at the same amount.
And the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes regional CPI numbers. So
correct.
That's where everyone that owns apartments or manages them, that's ultimately where you go to get that regional CPI and add the 5% on top of that.
Right.
And with a 10% cap. Hey, Chip, I want to ask you a question too, because the numbers reported for rent growth in Orange County and recently, and this was something that was in our magazine, Apartment News, showed in the last year 12.4% higher rents in Orange County, and that's over the last 12 months. Just wondering if we have a 10% maximum rent increase law, how do we get a 12.4% overall rent growth in Orange County?
A lot of that bases off of how those were calculated. And when you take a look at bringing in new units online, those were renting at a much higher level than they were the previous year. So you take a look around central Orange County, you take a look around Huntington Beach, Santa Ana, Costa Mesa, Orange up into Anaheim. Seen a lot new development come Garden Grove as well. A lot of new developments that are commanding a much higher rent level than the average rent was previously. So whereas those units are, you see an overall jump. First of all, most people took their total amount that they could raise the rents where they could. So that took up a lot of people's ability to raise their rents. But then you bring on a lot of high-end new units, and the overall rent ratio skews higher, and that's how we got a little higher that way.
And I should add that statistic, which comes from at least the one I've quoted, came from RealPage, which is a national data aggregator for real estate. That was for 100-unit plus buildings that they surveyed. Now, there are exceptions to the rent control laws in California, the AB 1482 law. So single family units are excluded from rent control. I believe. And are there other exceptions? Who's not covered? What type of units are not governed by the rent control, statewide rent control?
And that's actually something that we're starting to see a little bit of question about. In general, we do say that yes, single family homes, condos, single unit properties like that are exempted. However, there was a provision in AB 1482 that those that are owned in LLCs, where there's multiple units owned, may not be covered by rent control. So as a result, or I mean, from the exemption. So there, if you're somebody that has a number of houses that you're renting out on a long-term basis, and you have them all under a singular LLC, there's a chance that they may be subject to rent control. In general, the units that are exempted are those, as David mentioned, anything 15 years, built 15 years ago or newer, those would be exempted. So whether that's an apartment building, a condo complex, single family homes, whatever, those will be exempted. Any single family homes, as you identified, or condos, as I put in there, that are owned by a single owner, those would be exempted from rent control. But we are starting to see a little bit of this nuance in the law related to LLC owned properties starting to create a little bit of problem and becoming a little bit litigious.
Let me ask you about that 15-year time frame, because I had thought there was a 1997 and newer was an important date that I thought excluded owners from rent control. Do you know about that 1997? Is that still meaningful, or is it just 15 years previously? Because 15 years would take us to 2007. So is that the operative date for if it's built 2007 or later, rent control does not apply? David, you want to take that one?
The thinking was new development. They wanted to provide ample time, or at least 15 years, to get a rate of return on the capital investment in the development of that new apartment unit. And I guess, I don't know how they calculated 15 years, if it's more of a politically negotiated number, or if you're looking just at general, projections of recapturing the investment of 15 years is sort of a sweet spot. But ultimately that was, for the purposes of 1482, what was deemed to be the appropriate number.
Okay. And how, David, you interface with many apartment owners and managers on a daily basis. As far as 1482 goes, the law that limits rent increases to no more than 10%, and the formula that we discussed, is that palatable? Do you think would apartment owners in Orange County be, and I'll use the term happy, but satisfied if it stopped right there? Would that be acceptable? What is the attitude about the current rent control law?
Well, I'll tell you, Nick, I was a little surprised by some of the reactions I got from some of our members who have been longtime investors and maybe have amassed a decent sized portfolio. I would have figured that they would have been extremely concerned about that 10% cap. But in talking with many of them in the months that followed, implementation of AB 1482, many of them felt that while they didn't like it, they could live with it. And I was surprised by that, because for me, especially when I look at it from a public policy perspective, I have a hard time separating that business decision from just the symbolism of the camel's nose under the tent and the gradual erosion of property rights and certainly the ability to set rents at a level that you feel are appropriate for your particular situation. But yeah, I mean, there are people, like I said, who are certainly not happy about it and would rather not see anything, but they've kind of they've acknowledged that it is what it is and they will adjust, and they are certainly feeling like it's something that they will be able to deal with and just sort of work in to their long-term business plan.
And I guess we note that in the years that have passed since the passage of the statewide rent control, apartment values have not declined. On the contrary, apartments have done very, very well. Tremendous appreciation in multifamily properties. It's hard to connect dots, though, to see what effect, if any, or how that works with rent control. But just to say, good to see that multifamily investment in that asset class has continued to do very well. Chip, what would you say the climate is in Sacramento now in terms of any further rent control, or what do legislators have in mind in this area going forward?
When it comes to rent control, we don't see a lot of change at this moment. What we're seeing more of a trend to is taking a look at the Ellis Act and how reforms from that could be made. For those of you that may or may not be familiar with the Ellis Act, just a brief overview. Right about the same time that the Costa-Hawkins Act went into effect back in the 90s, which was an attempt to curb any of these rent controls from moving forward. The Ellis Act also came out, and what the Ellis Act in effect says is you have the right to go out of business. So if you're an apartment building and you want to convert to condos, you're technically going out of business. Or if you want to convert it to short-term rentals or something like that. And that was an attempt to allow the property owner the right to either come in and significantly rehabilitate their property and go out of business for a period of time while they're doing that, and then re-release them onto the market. Or they're looking at it as maybe you're tearing down the building and building something new, or any of those kinds of things. So it's something that down here in Southern California hasn't been a major issue that we've been looking to do, other than in some of the coastal communities. You've seen a lot of problems with this in Los Angeles along Venice, a little bit in Santa Monica, although they find ways to choose what they get angry about. But it was a major issue up in San Francisco, where a lot of these older properties that were at one time single family homes that have been semi-converted into 4 to 6 units and sometimes 8, that they're now starting to try to say, okay, I can tear this down and build something new, which displaced a lot of people that were otherwise low income individuals. So, or they were paying a much lower rent. So we're not seeing the attack so much on rent control right now. They're kind of seeing that as a settled issue on the state level. They're instead looking again at Ellis Act related issues. We just defeated a bill yesterday, 854, that died on the assembly floor that would have taken away some of those protections for property owners. What we are seeing is a lot of attacks on the local level, where different cities are implementing a series of different standards that are awful.
And we're going to talk about Santa Ana here in a minute. But let's just a little bit more on the statewide rent control and just cause eviction, and just to clarify what that means. David, can you explain the situations where landlords are who would otherwise be covered by statewide rent control are able to raise their rents to market rent? When are they free to do that? If a tenant voluntarily moves out, can you raise the rent to market rent?
Yeah, up to this point, that is an issue that has not been carried out to the extreme that we would not be able to deal with. Yes, unless you have a local ordinance which deals with preemption, you will be able to raise upon vacancy your rents up to market. That, of course, is a great threat that is ever present. We know if the desire of a influential legislator were to kind of head in that direction, this might be something that could come back very quickly and hurt us all. But thankfully, I think the biggest proponent of extreme housing policies such as that, David Chu, in the Assembly, he resigned his seat a number of months back to become the city attorney for San Francisco, and so he was very hard charging on many of these rental housing policies, which we viewed as being extremely problematic and potentially devastating for our industry. There are certainly others who I'm sure will come behind and seek to elevate themselves to a similar position as Assemblymember Chu had. But for now, it looks like things are at bay at best, but we certainly are aware of the threat, and it can very easily come back. And the ability to bring your units up to market upon vacancy is something that could very easily be called into question by new legislative policy should it be introduced.
So for the moment, just cause, so-called just cause eviction means that if a landlord has a tenant, if as a one-year lease agreement, at the end of that year, they cannot evict the tenant unless there is quote unquote just cause, which would mean some kind of breach of the agreement by the tenant. The landlord cannot simply evict the tenant and raise the rent to market. Is that a correct explanation of just cause eviction? You want to take that one, Chip, or you want to explain what is meant by just cause eviction?
Yeah, I think that's a good rough overview of the concept. But one of the challenges that it brings with it is, in order to qualify as a just cause, and I may ask Dave to help me go through the nuance on this, in order to qualify for what is a just cause in order to evict someone, you more or less have to have a standing witness that saw the person perpetrate a crime on property, have a police report. Typically an arrest is not enough, but also a conviction in order to qualify for that just cause to be completely in effect. So the intent is, yes, to prevent the idea of somebody kicking someone out just so they could raise rents, which I think most people would understand why that's a problem. But the way that they've defined it is such that it becomes nearly impossible to meet the standards of what would be a defensible just cause eviction.
Mhm.
And the problem with that is it ends up creating so many more problems for the other tenants in the building, because they then have to live with this individual who is being a problem in their community. And the only way they can get out of it is to stand in front of this person and be a witness to their abhorrent behavior until enough information has been compiled to qualify to evict this individual, which is not what the intent of that legislation is, but is a practical application of it. Dave, would you categorize it differently?
No, I mean, I think that's certainly the unintended consequences of many of the policies coming out of Sacramento. They have an idealized view of, okay, we were trying to protect people who are perhaps being, targeted for rent increases simply to, get them out or whatever, but there are certain circumstances where if applied incorrectly or in a manner which was not originally envisioned, it really does tie the hands of the housing provider. And it does actually, run the risk of worse problems being created. Yeah, I do know in certain circumstances, and this is something that's still allowable in most jurisdictions. If you want to take your unit off the market and for an extended period of time do renovations where it would not be technically able to be inhabited, that might create that opportunity then to raise the rents for that particular unit. But it does require being taken off the market for a few months at any given time before you could put it back out there.
Correct.
Okay. Now, before we get into the recent Santa Ana, City of Santa Ana ordinance and what impact it will have on the marketplace, but let's just review briefly the California Rental Assistance Program. The United States, through Congress, has created funding for the states that passes through to all 50 states for funds to be used that are being used in California to assist people that have been COVID impacted. At least I think that, I believe that part's accurate, where there are situations, many situations, that renters will get 100% of their rent provided from the state, and landlord will receive directly. By the way, if you qualify, the checks that are sent out from the state of California go directly to the landlord. David, what do you know about the program and the continuance of the program, because there's a finite number of dollars. I've heard recently $1 billion flowed into California. Is this rental assistance expected to continue for a long time, or are we about to run out of funds and will that program shut down?
Well, good question, Nick. This is actually a topic we had an extensive webinar on last week. We had a representative from the State Department of Housing and Community Development who's very much involved in the rental assistance program right now and its operations. There are multiple rounds of funding, if you will, and the California program gets periodic infusions of federal funding. It does look like the existing pot of funds is certainly being used, but they are anticipating an infusion of more federal funding coming in. So to say that it's running out of money, I would say is it depends how you look at it. But no, I think we will see rental assistance continuing for the foreseeable future, especially a state of California's size and population. And certainly influence, back in Washington, D.C. and with the Biden administration, I'm sure we will be well taken care of as far as having reliable funding continuing to come into the program. But yeah, it's not it's not unlimited. We do need to keep going back and requesting additional funds. And I will say, it's certainly it's a program that has been frustrating for many rental housing providers who have been trying to get updates once they have applied and provided their information for that rental assistance. Sometimes they're dealing with some of their tenants who have not taken the appropriate steps to either sign up and apply or have not followed through in providing some of the information that is needed for the application itself to be finalized. Communication certainly with the program representatives has been inconsistent at best, but there's certainly a number of individuals who at this point they have received some funding, and it's one of those things where yes, the landlord is supposed to be getting the money directly, but there are cases where the tenants have not provided the funds once they have received that from the state, and it's an imperfect program. But I think it's important to recognize that this is something that was pulled together very quickly and did not have the luxury of identifying potential pitfalls in the rollout process. At this point, I think we're dealing more with just this is what we have to deal with, and it's not going to get better as far as the functionality aspect. They can make many little course corrections perhaps, but wholesale changes to improve the process the way I think we would want to see, I wouldn't put much money on that happening. But but it is continuing to exist, and monies will be there, and it requires a lot of patience, and certainly, for many of our rental housing providers who are part of our association, multiple phone calls, be the squeaky wheel. That's what we're kind of telling them when they are calling the state for updates. Don't take no for an answer necessarily, but be polite. That's kind of, I think, the people will get very, personally invested. I mean, obviously there's a lot of rental, income that has been delayed and lost as a result, and they're certainly they're frustrated, and rightfully so. But as we said last week, and when I was introducing the speaker, don't shoot the messenger. They're trying the best they can. They're dealing with their own staffing limitations as well as are so many others. It's a challenge, to say the least.
RIAOC audience, there's your takeaway from today, which is from David Cordero: be polite. Okay, rules to live by. My mom taught me that decades ago. But yeah, it's pragmatic too when you're trying to obtain funds through the state. Yeah, dollars are there, good thoughts, but implementation, as you've been expressing, David, is another thing. There is, to a degree, though, a subsidy that is passing into the hands of rental housing owners that have been able to to connect with this program and manage to maneuver through and obtain funds. And I've spoken to apartment owners that were very pleased that they were getting checks from the state on units that had not been paying. So it can be helpful if you can manage to figure out how to make use of it.
Dick, I will just say also, for those who have applied and have already gotten some funding, but perhaps need to update their ledgers for their tenants who have not paid in order to continue getting payment, that's critical. Continue to update your application file that you have created through the Housing is Key portal, and certainly keep communicating with your renters. It's a two-way situation, and if you've got good renters who are legitimately struggling and trying to do the right thing, this is a team effort, and I think that's the best way to approach things.
And they have to be, these are COVID impacted people, and you have to provide a statement that says you've been COVID impacted, but I don't know that there's any checking on that. So some tenants have figured out, hey, this is, we can simply sign this form, turn it in, and get into the program. But let's now, and just one other takeaway in all seriousness now is that the Apartment Association of Orange County deals with these issues. For those of you that aren't members, if you're in the multifamily arena and you get a partner in the Apartment Association of Orange County to help you understand some of these complex matters. And also what your membership does is help the apartment association deal with legislative affairs, and in some cases try to improve the situation out there. And that brings me to the topic of Santa Ana. Chip, can you give us an overview on what has occurred in the city of Santa Ana, the first city in Orange County to pass rent control legislation? What does it look like? What are the limits, and who does it impact?
I wouldn't say I'll happily explain it to you, but I will go through it. And just to give a little bit of background here to let you guys see how some of this stuff develops so that you realize how important it is to stay on top of your city councils. I was actually originally brought on here to help redevelop the government affairs program that they have here. As you mentioned, from my history, my background, I've done it for organizations across the country and internationally. But the second day I was in here, the city of Santa Ana literally surprised everybody in the housing industry by announcing on their city council agenda they were going to vote on rent control the following Tuesday. I believe that was Wednesday, Dave. Yeah.
Yep.
And Dave looked at me, and Dave and I have known each other for a number of years, looked at me with a look on his face like, please do not kill me for this, but I need you to completely shift your strategy. And we all did. And not only was the housing industry shocked by this, as this went on, we found out there were other members of the city council that had no idea this was going to be introduced the following Tuesday, had no concept of it whatsoever.
And let's, Chip, just, excuse me for interrupting, just I want to define one thing and why this has been a very dramatic law is that this rent control in Santa Ana has a 3% annual cap. That's the most you could increase rents. And if depending on the CPI, it may be less than that. So, that's as compared to the state of California, which has this 10% cap. So much more stringent limitations in Santa Ana.
Correct. And they came up with this without meeting with any of the housing providers. That means us, that means the mobile home parks, that means the realtors, that means the builders, none of us.
So who's covered by this? Are there, are single family residences covered, or are there limitations on who is limited and who's not limited by the rent control of Santa Ana?
The way they wrote it was to comport with the AB 1482 rules and the exemptions for single families like that. However, the way they are messaging it when they have their city council or their city updates for the citizens is that it applies to every single property. Maybe if you're a single family home, you might be excluded. and we are yet to see what sort of enforcement they're doing, but they're trying to put it on every single property.
Now, let's talk, and we don't have a lot of time left, so I want to get into some important questions about politically. David, do you expect other Orange County cities to follow suit with Santa Ana and implement rent control?
I think the threat is certainly real as far as the expansion of rent control to other jurisdictions, especially those that have large renter communities. Primarily North and Central County, I think, would be the prime area where you could see, it expanding to maybe Anaheim, Fullerton, Garden Grove, Westminster, down along, the 55 road to Costa Mesa. Basically, the heart of Orange County is, I think, where rent control policies could very well, take root. Now, right now, there are no other cities that are actively discussing implementation of rent control. I just want to stress that, but you certainly have tenant activist groups that operate in multiple jurisdictions. And what we saw in Santa Ana this past fall very easily can spread just through the tenants themselves, talking and working with community organizers in those other jurisdictions, where it becomes a grassroots push for cities to discuss and take action on something like this.
Well, is the apartment association or other associations, there's also the California Apartment Association, are they, and David, are you considering mounting some kind of legal challenge to this new legislation in Santa Ana?
Well, we attempted to qualify a referendum shortly after the city council passed the rent control and just cause eviction ordinances. We have 30 days from the time it was signed to qualify and collect the necessary number of signatures. We utilized a professional signature gathering firm who had done similar types of campaigns in other parts of the state previously with a 100% success rate. We had about a 2-week period where things were going very well with daily signature gathering. The rent control activists mobilized at that point, and the tide turned. What I will categorize as guerrilla tactics, not only in the shopping centers and the neighborhoods where the signature gatherers were working, but also via social media, and utilizing, I would say, tactics that the signature gatherers and the firm itself had never dealt with before when it came to tenant groups in those other jurisdictions. And it very quickly tanked our collection efforts, in large part because a lot of the residents who were being approached and asked to consider signing the petitions felt intimidated, or because of the tactics that were being used, directly in front of them, where you had these tenant activists, trying to play gotcha with the signature gathering and capture them on their cell phones on video, misspeaking, and utilizing that as justification to say that the proponents of the referendum were lying to the voters. It turned a lot of people off, where they did not want to even get involved because they didn't know at that point who to believe. And
so, needless to say, there is a well-organized constituency of tenant rights groups that are, it's going to be a battle for landlords and property managers to combat that movement. What is, Chip, in terms of the argument that is made, has traditionally been made in terms of a counter argument to rent control, which is that it is a disincentive to developers or to the creation of affordable housing. What are you hearing from those when that is presented, that argument? Hey, if you limit rents, developers aren't going to want to build more units, and we need units desperately. How is that argument addressed by tenants' rights groups or those that are proponents of rent control?
To answer, when it comes to the tenants' rights groups, they just don't believe anything that's said. So let's not even address their standing on that.
Let me ask it
let's
this way.
focus on what the elected officials that are deciding these things end up doing. And for a long time, that was an argument that made a lot of sense. And now what we've started to see is a lot of people reference, there was a really great study that was done related to rent control back about 3-4 years ago by a group out of Stanford. And what they were doing was looking at several areas of San Francisco to identify, is it positive, is it negative, what are the impacts of that sort of thing. And what they have done is take a look at it. And effectively what they came back with is that it is not good for the community, but it may not be as bad as we previously thought, because they were able to identify that despite the fact that there is rent control and those impacts, there's still development happening in San Francisco. What we've attempted to point out to them is Irvine is not San Francisco. Riverside is not San Francisco. There are a lot of communities where if a developer comes in and sees that they're going to build and they can build in the next city over and not worry about it, they're just going to move to the next city over. For those of you that, I mean, many of us have visited San Francisco, in a lot of ways, it's very cordoned off from the rest of the peninsula, as well as the rest of the Bay Area. So if you want to build, you have to build in San Francisco. Maybe you could go to Colmer, South San Francisco, or a couple of those areas there down towards Burlingame and whatnot, but you're not going to see the same kind of return there as you would if you were to here in San Francisco or in this area say, okay, well, I don't want to build in Santa Ana because they've got this rent control law. I'll just move over to Tustin, or I'll just move over to Garden Grove and build there, which that is a real impact that city elected officials need to identify. Is not that it won't stop the development, it's that it's not going to stop it's not going to allow for development to happen in your city. And that's what we're trying to get them to understand. And some of them are coming around.
Okay. Yeah, good explanation for that. Thank you for that overview. Before we go, I just want to ask Chip and Dave to put in the chat, if you could, your contact information. Any of our audience that would want to know more or would want to join the Apartment Association of Orange County. Again, your support, if you do that, yes, disclosure, I'm a longtime member and I've observed the good things that AAOC does and has done over the decades. But you are supporting this political arm or legislative affairs arm of AAOC to stay on top of all these legislative movements that affect multifamily housing. So please add your contact information so anyone could make contact with AAOC. And we've gotten past our time frame now. It's past 9:30. Time flew. I want to thank Dave and Chip for being here today, taking time out of your schedules, and for being leaders in this field where representation is needed by apartment owners and everyone invested in the multifamily industry. It's a great industry. It's a vital industry. It's the backbone of so much of America is rental housing, but of course we want to keep it healthy for the long term. And I think there's great leadership in place at AAOC. So thank you, gentlemen, for providing that and for being here today. And on that note, if John, our president, John Hardowitz, is available, let's swing this meeting back over to you, and we'll stop recording at this point.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for a great discussion of rent control. And we'll stop the recording now.